less than 4 departments, EE, CS, linguistics, and psychology. So that should give you a hint that this other speaker has wide interest and is going to do a very interesting talk on something which isn't super common around here, and that's speech production.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks again to all of you for having me here. So I said, well, probably I'll talk about something that, it's sort of unusual and wacky. Most of my talks are wacky and unusual. So this is one of them. This is a topic that's of, great fondness and interest for me because, speech production is something that I started doing early on as a student. And I'm fortunate to continue working in this area. So today, probably, what I want to share is some of the work that we've been doing in the last few years in speech production, and even less so in trying to use that information for doing some useful things, both scientific and technological. So I'll try to share what we've been doing so far on this. Please feel free to kind of stop me and ask me questions, and I'll talk for about 50 minutes. All right, so as long as we've been around, right, humans have been, talking to one another. There's been lots of interest in, understanding, what underlies human speech processes at various levels, from the social level to, what's going on in the brain. So lots of different kind of approaches to studying speech. So what I'll focus on today is on, more on the articulation and speech production part of this complex facility we have. Particularly, I'll talk about a method that we've been trying to develop and work on using MRI, or magnetic resonance imaging, and then show some examples of how this data can be useful for answering questions about, things that of linguistic interest, things of interest in cognitive science, or, even useful for, for technological applications like speech recognition. So speech production, as we know, is a very complex thing. There are various layers of human involvement here, from the neurocognitive level to actually the social level of people interacting with one another, and how that mediates what we speak and how we speak it. As a result, there's also a lot of diversity and variability in the speech signal and speech production. Everything from that are developmental, age-related, based on skills, personal preferences, your background, the context in which we speak, noisy environment is a very well-known problem, right? Cocktail party effects, Lombard effects, and also, pathological and health conditions. As a result, the kind of questions, in the research that people ask in speech are also varied, to reflect this complex nature. There are people who look at details of articulation, the underlying control, motor control issues, to actually understanding things that are about clinical translation questions, to, in fact, questions related to technology development. So a whole variety of questions one could ask, and people do, crisscross these two. So as a result, this is a very highly interdisciplinary sort of endeavor. So in our lab, in particular, we've been interested in some aspects of speech production. One, particularly taking the view of this compositional view that speech production, is composed of, both abstract and, its representation in its implementation can be viewed as something that can be composed of from simple to more complex things, and how these things vary over time, how they're implemented over time, and how they relate to underlying cognitive representations. Particularly, we are fond of a framework of articulatory phonology, and use that to guide many of our theoretical sort of explorations in this field. But to sort of go hand in hand with this, right, we do a lot of work on the technological and computational side to inform these studies, both using interesting signal processing and mathematical methodologies, but also using these data to answer back questions of linguistic interest. So in general, the kind of approach we take is fairly data-driven. While it's sort of grounded in theoretical framework, we also, believe that, we have to learn speech, this complex phenomena by actually observing as much as possible. And there's no single methodology that's there that can allow us or give us a window into all the complex things that are going on. So it's, by nature, it's got to be multimodal. So we look at a number of different techniques to study even speech production, like MRI and, of course, audio data and other types of tracking methodologies. On the one hand, to deal with this kind of data, to make sense out of these data, we need both to acquire, to analyze, a lot of interesting developments that need to happen both in signal processing and machine learning and so on. And to be able to do sort of interesting things, we have to be grounded in, interesting hypotheses and questions, whether it is about dynamics of speech production, what is happening, what can we say about the underlying control and representation, to when, what are things that are individual. One of the things that people talk about often in speech research is production research is variance and invariance in speech production. Now, what are the things that are common? What are the things that are variable across individuals? So, more we have data, we can actually do in a very systematic way, evidence-driven approaches to speech production. So, some of the questions we are looking at about this compositionality in time, how things are implemented. We study very specific case studies, help us inform, very, very narrow questions like, okay, how are things coordinated when you produce a nasal sound? I'll show some examples later on. 2, things about, when people make speech errors, like all of us do, whether it is filler pauses or other kinds of errors, it actually gives you a window into some of the underlying cognitive representations. So these kinds of specific case studies help us, in addition to, the tools for measurements and tools for modeling, actually questions of interest of this sort provide us a way of getting at it. So this sort of confluence of both empirical, theoretical, and technological ways, let us take steps forward in speech production research. So one of the things that, that's been realized over centuries, in fact, in speech production research, the data is very important. And imaging has, in fact, been a very, very important sort of venue or tool that researchers have used. Even early 20s and 30s, people have used, when radiography came out, people started using, hey, I want to see what people are doing inside so that I can get an idea of it. And, the famous studies of, Gunnar Font and Ken Stevens and so on was informed by one Russian informant whose x-rays they took. They couldn't continue that because, x-rays are not good for people. They found out later on, radiation is not good. But other kinds of methodologies people have, developed. I'll show you some of these. Each of these is not perfect in a sense that they provide some advantages, but many are limitations. Ease of use, safety, and interpretation of the data. So here are some examples. X-rays I mentioned. The other is flesh point tracking. So people put sort of little sensors on these moving articulators and measure its movement over time. So that gives you some handle on the processes. Ultrasound doesn't have radiation. It's fairly portable, non-invasive, but only gives you a partial view, incomplete view of the vocal tract. Palatography looks at contact patterns, when people make, and indirectly people infer about timing in speech, which is an important, source of information. So here's the classic picture, a movie of. Can you see that? This is the X-ray movie. This is the denture, so to orient you. And in fact, this is Ken Stevens.
Why did Ken set the soggy neck on top of his deck?
So this kind of data, in fact, pushed the field forward quite a bit in speech signal processing and acoustic theory of speech production and so on. But you saw the moving vocal tract. It's very faint, and it's very hard to kind of use this for modeling. And more importantly, I said it's not very safe. Ultrasound, in fact, Maureen Stone, well-known speech researcher, she used to be at Hopkins before. She used a lot of this kind of methodology to study.
It ran a lot.
So what you're seeing is sort of the transducer placed here. You see the the outline of the tongue, and people can infer a lot of interesting questions. Here's the palatography. Basically what it is, it's like a retainer. It's got an array of sensors, contact sensors. It'll tell you what contact patterns are made when you speak like this.
My pal Al saw the SS Pinafore.
So these are sides of the tongue here, tip of the tongue, and with the time series data, people can use this as production data, and here's just a 3D view.
Hey, party again.
So these are just some examples of the kind of production data people have used and continue to use. Here's another method, magnetometry, or electromagnetic articulography, that, as people say, has little Rice Krispie-like sensors that are placed on moving articulators. So as you can see, it's a little invasive, not very pleasant. But once in there, in the magnetic field, you can track the movement. It's like motion capture, right? It is motion capture. And so you get data of this sort, like, for example. So in all these cases, what we have is data that that provides you direct information about some of the production, speech production, in addition to the acoustic data that it accompanies. So all these are different forms. And another important sort of modality that came into being, like in the mid-90s and so on, is MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. We've all seen MRI. The one striking thing is the good soft tissue contrast it gives. So people say, well, can we use that for speech studies? So lots of advantages, because it basically takes MR imaging, as in a very very high level view. It relies on the natural hydrogen proton content basically present in water, and different tissues have different water content. Hence, when you excite that with an appropriate magnetic field and release, you can actually image the tissue. It's non-invasive, no ionizing radiation. You can do any arbitrary scan plane. And the data you get is amenable to quantitative modeling, and that's exciting. So speech researchers, we thought, well, can we use this for speech research? But it has lots of limitations and challenges. First of all, there's physical limitations of how fast you can do. There's always a space-time trade-off. And things that don't have water are hard to image, like teeth, because there's no water in it. And also, for doing speech research, we also want to record speech alongside images. So all these are some of the challenges. So the question, over the years, people have been trying to slowly chip away at some of these. And I'll talk about that. This is one of the interesting modalities. So the nice thing is, like, with this kind of data, we'll show that how this is very helpful for both pushing scientific inquiry and also technology development in nice ways. So early work, happened at Hopkins, and my own work in thesis work is that we see here, to orient you, you'll see pictures like this a lot. This is what we call a sagittal view. That is, imagine cutting a plane right here in the middle of your head. So here's the lips and tongue body, the palate, the soft palate velum, airway. So what you can do is, since you can put it in any plane, this gives you a really complete view of the human vocal tract, and you can measure in the details. So things like, airway, area functions can be measured. So people who are interested in acoustics of speech can take this information and start simulating it with a 3D model, how these sounds are produced. Or you can also think about how different vocal tract filtering, shaping strategies are used by humans to produce different sounds. For example, we showed that for making a sound like S, right, we actually use very complex, tongue shaping. We groove the tongue so that we hit the air jet on the teeth to create this fricative noise. It's like very complex aerodynamics. And in fact, using such data, we can in fact simulate these complex filtered noise functions that we produce and that we perceive as specific speech sounds, like S and Sh and F. They're complex things. So it's very tantalizing to see if you have good data about the geometry of the vocal tract, and with appropriate mathematical modeling technique, we can actually explain what the underlying mechanisms are. So that was exciting. But that's not really speech, right? Still, we are looking at sort of static configurations of vocal tract and are able to talk about acoustics of speech, which people have been doing already with X-rays and so on. But but we could do more accurately. You can do finite element modeling, and we can look at noise sources, where they are produced, and those kinds of questions could be answered. But to speech, inherently a dynamic process, you want imaging that is sort of faster and that could capture this moving vocal tract in real time. So this is something that people started working on the last few years and tried to see. Yes, yes, sir. Yes. So, good question. So people usually in the speech production think about the supralaryngeal airway that involves the pharynx and the oral cavity and so on as one. And the vocal cords basically movements. Although in this talk I'm not going to be talking about those measurements, they move at different rates. They use video fibroscopy, and later I can show you some of those movies too. But concurrently we're not able to do it yet because their rates are different. MRI is not good for it. Although we have done that by doing specific scan planing and playing around with, the rates are quite different. So articulators move at 10 to 12 hertz. So the kind of speeds that we were able to get with MRI is good to track that. But the movements of opening, closing are at much higher rates. So MRI is not good for it. But we were trying to see if there's the racing of the larynx and so on that we can track. So I won't talk about.
It would be nice to have data that show ball.
Exactly. So we are trying to see. We tried to do EGG for some sort of indirect measures of the voice source activity in conjunction with articulation, and we still haven't done it in the MR scanner, but we are doing it with outside. But that's a good question. So in terms of going back to the production tracking, so people have been trying to see, well, early on they said, well, how do I get the speed? One way is to kind of do the cine MRI. It's actually a more interesting engineering signal processing solution than actually modeling the actual running speech. In a sense that what people do is they have multiple tokens of the same utterance they want to do, and as I will illustrate later, it basically subsamples things so that you reconstruct it back in time to create the pseudo real-time images. Or you can increase the temporal sampling rate to get real-time MRI, which is what I'll focus on. So quickly, MRI basically, it's like rastering, in the 2D FFT acquisition. You go line by line to acquire each image and go on. So say if it takes 10 milliseconds per line, or basically you're going to get like 1.28 seconds to get one image. That kind of tells you how long it takes to get every image. So if the underlying process moves at a particular rate, you have to have the sampling such that you can catch things that you want. The sampling theorem tells us that. So in Cine, what people did was, they prepared the space ahead of time. So instead of figuring out everything, all the lines in one image per thing, what they'll just focus on just one part of the case space over time. And then if you have enough repetitions of the same token being repeated, right, utterance repeated, so you, in the second repetition, you catch another portion of the image. So you kind of get temporal sampling first and then cover the space. So you can then put them together to get real-time movement of speech sounds. So this is kind of interesting. It's a step forward, but the challenge is you rely on human consistency to make these utterance repetitions, say these very short tokens over and over again, and you got to trigger them appropriately. People have used clever methods like using the heart signal and other noise gating and clever signal processing to synchronize the data. So it's a nice step. Or what we can do is that we can improve the temporal resolution itself. So advances were made in cardiac imaging, particularly another moving part inside us is the heart that kind of beats. It's less complex than speech, I would like to think, because I'll show you some movies of speech production. But still, it was a nice starting point for us. So we could actually use interesting pulse sequence design, how we acquire the image, in addition to some hardware solution to do this. So before going further, I'll show you a movie So again, to orient you, here's the nose of the person, mouth, tongue, airway. Okay, so this is the soft palate velum, which opens and closes when we make sounds like N.
When the sunlight strikes raindrops in the air, they act as a prism and form a rainbow. The rainbow is a division of white light into many beautiful colors.
So this is kind of what we do. It's a very complex choreography of various articulators coordinated in space and time to shape these sounds that we make. And that was exciting for us. We could actually do recordings of people talking in the scanner, and that opened up a lot of questions. So just before I move further, I'll just fill you in some details. We designed some receiver coil to receive this. In MRI, you see the tube, right? That's a magnet that excites you. Then you have a receiver coil, head neck coil that you put, and you see it's a 4-element coil that we had. Now we are designing a 16-element coil to speed up, do parallel imaging, and so on. And my student cleverly also designed, tapped the RF signal in the scanner to do recordings in the scanner. We originally thought, we'll use multiple microphones. We had to use optical microphones because it's a magnetic field. You can't use the usual condenser microphones. But we found that the noise in the magnet, is fairly. If you've been inside a magnet, right, it's fairly noisy. The knocking noise, the fan noise, and the coolant noise, pump noise. All this is like pretty nasty. So audio processing was one of the very first steps we had to take care of. I'll show you an example in a moment. The actual pulse sequence, there's only one slide on that. Instead of this raster type thing, which our traditional 2D-FT acquisition is, we actually use the spiral imaging basically to gain the speed. And we also kind of do what we call interleaved acquisition. And so this kind of provided us a way of speeding up the image acquisition. And just to give you a feel for the noise, so this is noisy, be aware. Let me lower this. So that's how the recording sounds like inside the scanner. And the sentence for you might be familiar. And this was the very first, very simple sort of noise cancellation technique we use. People study, signal processing. There's a number of adaptive signal processing techniques you can use. Various varieties of, LMS algorithms. The nice thing we found that because of the noise types that we had were fairly regular. If you know what the pulse sequence we used, we can actually model them and to subtract the soft. We really didn't need a fancy multi-microphone solution, and we could get about 30 dB, boost to enhance the speech. Good enough for us to actually do joint speech production data, articulated data, acoustic data modeling. Okay, so the data collection looks like something like standard scanner, clinical scanner, and we put the stuff we rigged as a receiver coil, and we can actually go ahead and collect a lot of production data. So let me show you some examples of the kinds of data one could collect now. So here's a speech that is familiar to many of the speech researchers.
She had your dark suit in greasy washwater all the year.
That's timid sentences.
Don't ask me to carry a really red like that. These are the movements that shape the speech sound.
So kind of stuff. So now we can actually collect a lot of data like this. In fact, we just finished collecting from 10 speakers, a subset of this timid data. So this huge corpus, like terabytes worth of data, that now allows us to kind of use machine learning and other kinds of mathematical techniques to start exploring things in a data-driven way. You can also do spontaneous speech like switchboard type thing. You can have a dialogue with this person to, I asked this subject about music.
When it comes to singing, I love to sing French art songs. It's probably my favorite type of song to sing. I'm a big fan of Debussy. I also love opera.
So you saw, the disfluency fillers and everything. So you can have a natural conversation. You can also make them do other things like. So this is so we actually studied sopranos for a site. Now I won't talk about it here. So soprano challenge is like a pretty well-known problem. When sopranos sing at very high pitch, you lose the identity of what they're saying. So vowels are not recognizable. So the question always has been, what is that they're doing? Are they completely not ignoring the linguistic goal and just focusing on the pitch, or they're still, there's something else going on? In fact, what we found that while they're trying to sort of focus on the intensity and on the pitch, which are perfect even inside the scanner, what happens is you only see the vestigial aspects of the sounds they're trying to make. You can still see the shaping that they're trying to make, but the other thing overtakes. So it's not like they're not trying to do these sounds. They just, you're at the phase transition between these things. So opera teachers shouldn't get mad at them anymore. So this is my language. So you saw the retroflex sounds, right? So I'm a Tamil speaker, which is a South Indian language. So the tongue does gyrations there. Of course, you can also, this lets us do things with, in clinical population, we study clinical, apraxia.
Everything food, I love the food.
So you can actually start asking questions about motor control and, relating, because you have now direct observation, or you can study rappers.
We don't call trouble. We don't bother nobody with it. And when we walk up on the mic,
So, in fact, that's also an interesting thing to study rappers. Not just it's fun, but also the kind of sounds that they produce are a very, range a whole variety of things that are picked up from the inventory of sound possibilities. What was interesting is that still you see that the sounds that they use to do combinatorially, this compositional view, is you can find them across the world's languages. So cognitively, it says something about the kinds of acquired skills we have when we produce speech sounds. So there's a JASA paper on that that's just coming out, hopefully. But once you have this kind of data, so enough of showing off data, we can actually start using this data to ask interesting questions. You can start modeling things like, okay, I can compute what is the filter structure, I can create 3D of the tongue or the movement of the mouth and so on. So the question you ask is like, what kind of processing should we do? So the image processing, the signal processing questions depend on what you want to do with this data. Typically in traditional speech research, people have been interested in the airway volumes so that they can, relate that to their good relationships between what we know about the physics of the speech production to the signal. You can then say, well, how we can predict things or how can explain co-articulation and other types of phenomena. So one important thing is to be able to track the moving articulators in real time. The other ways, you might not want to do that explicitly. You might directly want to operate on images. Maybe if you want to generate feature vectors to use for inversion problems or for speech recognition, you might not necessarily care about tracking explicitly. So the kind of image processing we want depends on the kind of applications or purpose you want to use for. So one of the things that we did was to, since contour tracking is an important problem and speech movements are very complex, it's not very easy to do contour tracking there. So it was a very interesting image processing problem. The way we did was to actually, but this is a biological structure, so we can take advantage of generally what is happening. Now you know that there's going to be a tongue, there's going to be sort of the rear pharynx area, the upper sort of nasal cavity area and so on. So what we did was we kind of thought about these three-part model plus a background to say, well, can we use this to help contour tracking in real time? So the way we did was to look at the, minimize, difference image energy. So you have a model and you kind of deform the model to minimize the, the error energy. So that's a very simple idea, and we can set this up as an optimization problem. So these kinds of, image tracking, are pretty sort of well known mainly from the brain imaging side, but we try to kind of develop these methods for the moving vocal tract. And here's the algorithm in a very one slide. So what we did was, the innovative aspects of this was that we could directly do this optimization model fitting. So you have a model and you have the real data. You want to fit the model to the data. We could actually do it in the case space, the raw MR acquisition space, because we can actually come up with a closed form solution for the gradient function, and we can do this iteratively. So here, just to illustrate, so you start with this model, the first picture, and as iterations progress, you start fitting, minimizing energy, and the things you move around are the vertices of the polygons of these models that we fit. So, as is sort of conventional, yes. Say it again. It's done in this, acquisitions is done in these slices. It's not in 3D. So if you want to put 3D back together, it depends on, we are doing 3D volumetric reconstruction. So the question was, are these segmentations, contour segmentations done in one slice or in 3D? 3D usually is, for 3D MR, what we do is we acquire slices across to reconstruct the volume. For real time, basically, we only focus on one plane because we can't cover the whole volume in real time yet because the speed is not enough. But to construct, we also have some faster methods for 3D acquisition. What used to take 30 seconds we can do in like 4 seconds, but still it's not there. The 3D volumetric reconstructions are, you have to scan the whole thing and then segment and then put them together. So these are more single slice segmentation.
Just a quick follow-up.
Yes. So that's a good question, right? So much of speech studies, they typically rely on the sagittal sort of view, so that you can have the entire view of the vocal tract. You can see place of articulation, coordination between articulators and so on, and then that's limiting. And so now we can put, supplement that with sort of cross-sectional. You can put a couple of coronal slices. I'll show you some examples later on, say, in key places to get the geometry. Ideally, what we would like is, real-time 3D tracking. But we don't have any methodologies that would do it right now. So the way people have been doing, including us, to say, well, okay, I will kind of use a modality like ultrasound or point flesh pointer, I can get speedy images. Then I'll cross-register it statistically. Then I will get MRI with very high spatial quality. Then we put all these together, and that trend is what is going. It's happening. So it's actually sort of signal processing, not the acquisition, but later on. Yeah.
One more question.
Yes.
So you're doing 2D plus time sequence, right?
Right. These examples, yes.
Are you interested in also formal or actual
Yes.
text?
Yes, I will show you some examples because it's easy to kind of explain, to see the whole thing with sagittals, and they have been hence popular in speech research, as you probably know. But for certain things, like say you want to look at pharyngeal region or laryngeal region, or even regions here, I will show it's important to get coronal slices or axial slices or any cross-sectional slices. Yeah.
So, like you're using 2D slides.
Mm-hmm.
I think like some articulation, translation could be complex. So maybe 2D essentially cannot capture all the
True.
Yeah.
True. In fact, that's the case I tried to make in my NIH grant, that we need shaping is an important goal, and we need to actually have a more full view of the complex geometry. And true. So what we do is typically look at multiple slices. But the thing is, in MR, as you probably know, it's often a trade-off between space and time, how fast we can get and how much structure we can capture. And so we typically put them together sort of, by collecting different perspectives later on using signal processing. I think that's a way, at least right now, because there's fundamental limitations of how fast MR can go or any other technology. Yeah. So validate these kinds of segmentation tracking with phantoms, which is typically what is done. Here's some sample segmented images, the same. Show.
When the sunlight strikes raindrops in the air, they act as a prism and
So you can get fairly good, contour tracking. So this, if someone wants to use these contours as features for, say, from these data for doing speech recognition experiments, here you go. This is like a feature extractor, if you may. So here's some German data. So we were studying fricatives across languages. So this is German fricatives are interesting. And then once you have the contour, then you can capture, for example, area functions, the cross-sectional area of the vocal tract by, standard algorithms. These are pretty well studied. Or we can do direct image analysis. Here's an example. What you can do is look at there are specific regions in the vocal tract where there are constriction actions that are going on. So if you can focus on the correlated, intensity correlation in those regions, then you can actually track those time series as your feature representations. Why not? For example, so here there's like these 4 regions. You can look at the image intensity. So you can look at the intensity variations. They'll tell you, how much airway or closed tissue that you have, and that can be sort of yet another way of parameterizing or extracting features. So the point being, given this raw data, there are a number of ways of actually sort of analyzing this type of image sequences. So say we have all that kind of signal processing tools. Now, can we use this for answering some useful questions? So what I'm going to do is kind of show examples of different flavors to show the kinds of possibilities. So of course, with these types of data, there's lots of possibilities in doing spoken language research. Ask about spontaneous speech and variability and so on. But also there are lots of questions in the MR field itself. How can we do better image acquisition? How can you do cross-modal registration? Different perspectives or different modalities of acquisition. And of course, the big question is, how can you make use of this for specific clinical or technological application? So I'll try to give you a few examples here, and I can talk to you after the talk if you're interested in more that we are working on. So here's some examples I've selected. One, I wanted to show that shaping is important. For example, when we make complex sounds like S or R's, they are notoriously complex, and geometry is very important. As against vowels where we have open vocal tract and simple things where sagittal images 2D will can be used to extrapolate. These sounds are actually more complex, and I'll illustrate that. Then I'll talk about something about timing. How even in producing a sound like N, right, how multiple articulators are involved, and the timing coordination between different parts is important, and that is kind of mediated sort of with prosody and other things. I will talk about emotional speech, to show what happens when we speak, the same thing with different emotions. What is that we are doing to modulate those kinds of signals, and then show a couple of examples of how we can use this for potentially these data to inform things like speech recognition. Okay, so first question, work of machine, Eric. So does tongue shaping important, or is everything interpretable just from 2D sagittals, right? So let me show you. So here's the sagittal image, and here's the coronal image. So this image is taken right here, slicing like that. Okay, so that's the orientation. So this sagittal is like this, coronal is like that. Okay. So one of the things people do, so there are 2 fricative stridents, right? S and Sh. They're in many languages. And S you make by kind of grooving the tongue. Let me play this again, like cupping and shooting. S, the fricative noise is created by sliding the air through, by doming your tongue. So in the sagittal, you can't really make it out from just looking at a sagittal picture. So what people said, well, how stable are these kinds of shaping goals? Are these cognitively controlled? How is it, with regard to co-articulation? Can we quantify this? So these are questions we can start answering that with the availability of both the sagittal and coronal data. So we showed things like, for example, that the tongue grooving is an important feature for making a sound like an S, and more than just the constriction degree and location, which is what, in linguistic theory, people often refer to, place of articulation, constriction, sort of. But we sort of say, well, that's important, but also alongside, to reach the aerodynamic goals, we need to have the shaping as a part of the production perspective. So here, the important point again is that by having this type of 3D geometry data, we can actually start answering very well-known questions, but new things, insights that we didn't have before. Now, I'll give you an example of things where coordination in time is important. Okay, for example, we know that when we speak, right, the different, syntactic structure influences the phonetic implementation of the speech sounds. Speech sounds are not just, like beads in a string, right? So how they're implemented actually is modulated by suprasegmental goals, like prosodic goals. So here we kind of, I'll show you an example of implementing a nasal sound, N, right? You think, well, when you make an N, you think about it for a second, you raise the tongue tip to to the just behind your teeth, and you drop the soft palate that you can't imagine, because it's and you basically let the air flow through the nose, right? But the coordination between raising the tongue tip and dropping the velum it's important. And what people have shown is that that coordination is actually a very flexible coordination. It's not, depending on prosodically where the N is in an utterance, the timing characteristic varies. So it's a very complex timing control. Okay, so that we can study now. So look, so like any good phonetic experiment, we really construct, very carefully designed sentence to control for, syntactic structure and so on. So here we are looking at nasal position at the onset, at the beginning of word, quarter end, and at a juncture.
I can type no 5 times. I can type no 5 times. I can type no 5 times.
So what you're looking at is basically the movement of the tongue tip and the velum over time. Right? Now, once you have that, you can start asking questions about the relative timing between phasing. So we can think about this as a control system, right? Basically, in fact, we model this as coupled oscillator models. You can look at the phasing between these kinds of articulator structures. Now, we want to think about the prosodic structure on top of this model, how that lets this sort of timing be controlled. In fact, the important result here is that, whenever things are at the onset, they behave differently when they're not at the onset. And this is an interesting thing about the underlying cognitive control, about the timing specification. So these kinds of important insights about, the speech production, very fine details, can come out by having access to good data, but also accompanying sort of mathematical techniques to analyze this data. Okay. See, another thing that we take for granted in speech is like when we pause. Sometimes we pause because that's how the planning is. Sometimes we pause because we are disfluent, or we're thinking about to fill. So the nature of not all pauses are created equal. For people doing bad right now, that seems to be very popular. Cognitively, these are very interesting things when we don't speak. And so using this, sort of these types of data, we can actually look at what are the articulatory underpinnings of pausing in speech. So we have data like this. So you saw this data, I showed this example. We have lots of this spontaneous data. Then you can, actually, hypothesize that, these grammatical pauses, things that are actually, part of the linguistic structure, are actually choreographed as a part of the cognitive planning. Unplanned pauses basically interfere with these targets, and the reset happens, and the cognitive planner kicks in back. And we can actually show that how articulatorily these are sort of two different things. So to do that, basically we looked at the articulatory movements and energy of those, and showed that in fact the relation between the grammatical pause and the articulatory energy before that actually was significantly different in the case of the grammatical case, and not in the case of the ungrammatical case. But once the pausing is done, whether it's due to a disfluency or due to a regular sort of what is expected in your speech production, then things reset back to speaking whatever you have in your mind afterwards. So this kind of very important sort of observations that you start putting pieces of puzzle to understand the speech production phenomena. And these things are possible now because we are able to actually gather evidence and go at it systematically. Okay, so these are sort of, now I'm building case, from structural shaping to timing to sort of overall kind of planning to actually things that are beyond the linguistic realm. That is, so if you have affective modulations in speech, how does it affect the underlying linguistic goals, right? So that's another question one could ask. So it's well known in the emotional speech domain that not all speech sounds are get colored by emotional effect equally. For example, things like high vowels are pretty resistant to emotional modulations. So you speak words E, for example, right, that have E. E gets less affected by you being angry or happy as compared to vowels like R, A, like low vowels. People have shown this from acoustic studies. Now we can actually sort of see what strategies people are using, both in space and time, to affect emotional articulation. So you can put actors in MRI scanner and ask them to be emotional like this.
The doctor made the scarf home with antiseptic.
Or
don't compare me to your father.
Or you can make them sad.
The doctor made the scarf home.
Or you can make them sound perky.
The doctor made the scarf home with antiseptic.
So then you have lots.
The doctor made.
So then you have these data. You can look at, say, you can do, say, for example, PCA of this image data, and you can start looking at the coefficients of this, and if they are what their relationship with the underlying emotional factor. You can do a lot of interesting computational modeling once you have data, right? And in fact, you can see that you can also do the same thing with the point tracking, and you look at the kinematics of these movements when emotions are displayed and expressed in speech, and can ask questions. Hey, what is the role of emotion? How does it interplay with speech production? And we can show that, in fact, this bound by the linguistic context a lot. And wherever you have articulatory freedom, you start seeing the effects of emotions there. So if you think about encoding information in the speech signal as sort of a, from a communication theoretic perspective, then you can start thinking about these layers of, linguistic and paralinguistic information as a part of the same speech chain.
How much can you get from the palatography? Can you get
Palatography is very hard because it only gives you contact patterns. So it's mainly used for timing studies. So for example, you're modulating boundary strength, and people have used that early on. But it's very hard to interpret that data also with if we don't have other. It'll be used, we put pressure sensors instead of just contact sensors. It'll tell us a little bit, but it doesn't give you any geometry information. So in terms of modeling, so it's the last phase of my talk. So far what I talked about was mostly give you examples of linguistic analysis and speech analysis type thing. Now we can start thinking about, okay, how can we use these type of data to help with speech modeling? So one of the important things that it's questions that we wrangle with over years is this huge variability in speech, right? There's variability across people. Each of us has a different physical system, so even though we try to speak the same thing, it all comes out more or less similar but also different. So we are all often trying to understand what is variable and what is not, and this is like an age-old question. So one of the marginalizing factors that we need to worry about is that how does the physical structure influence the strategies we use, and that's not well understood yet. But now, having these kinds of data, right, we can actually computationally start attacking these kinds of questions, the relation between structure and function. So morphology, for example, tells you how your palate is shaped, your head is shaped, and all that stuff. So once you have that, we can actually, both through simulations and studying how you speak, we can start forming picture about how your patterns emerge, how as a child, right, a child is growing, right, the morphology changes. How does it influence the kind of acquisition of speech sounds and the production of speech sounds? So these kinds of questions are possible. And in fact, for example, if you have like hundreds of speakers worth of data, so we looked at, for example, my student Adam looked at the palatal structure, for example, and it showed that the concavity of how your palate is concave pretty much explains about 50% of the variance. Then the inflection where it kind of bends tells you much of the rest, and the angularity of this bend tells you the remaining variance. So the point being is each of us, even when you look at the oral cavity structure, we all have different structures, and we try to move our tongue and jaw around this and produce speech, right? So what is that we do? And so with simulation studies, for example, right, we can show that the palatal structure effects actually, we can show that it has specific acoustic consequences in, say, producing vowels. So these kinds of things can be systematically attacked now. People have, in linguistics often talk about, apical sounds and laminal sounds, or how you make, R's with your, tongue tip up or bunched. One of the explanatory factors for that, I believe, is, if you understand the morphology, we can sort of, at least check off that, marginalize that factor out of this equation, and then focus on what is actually cognitively planned. So what I'm trying to say is, things that are physically dictated versus things that are sort of, strategically planned by, a higher level process have to be sort of, there's always a confound between them, and we need to understand that better. Okay, so final part of my talk, I want to talk about, little work on how these kinds of production data can inform sort of doing speech recognition. So typically, we can view human speech communication sort of from a communication theoretic point of view, right? So transmitter, receiver, noisy channel. And in fact, people have shown these human communication systems that the production, when I produce speech, right, it's informed by my perception systems. That's well known. People have shown that. It's famous, there's a paper by Mike Jordan, or how do you know? Mike Jordan, for a machine learning person, he actually did a lot of excellent work in speech production and research early on. There's also evidence that my own production system informs how I perceive, right? How I talk, how I speak actually influences how I understand speech. And there's sort of, evidence from sort of activation of motor areas when I'm, that is, areas of speech production in the brain when I'm listening and processing speech. But there's many gaps there in all these areas, because while neuroscience and imaging, brain imaging is developing a lot, speech production is advancing, the link between production and perception is still, there's lots of gaps there and lots of open questions, including between the relation between how is speech encoded in articulation, how is it related to how it is processed. So these are some basic questions that are out there. So one simple thing we asked is like, okay, is there any sort of relationship from, say, information theoretic relationship between articulative movements and the kind of front-end processing that happens, say, in the cochlear filter bank. So we can say, well, if I have articulatory data and some feature representation of acoustic data, can I study what the patterns of, say, the mutual information would be? So this is the question my student Prasanta asked. So to do this sort of exercise, what we said, well, let's think about, designing filter banks, possible filter banks, number of choices. Of all the filter banks that I have, can I find one that maximizes the mutual information or minimizes the uncertainty that's contained in the production data? So that's a question we asked. So, yes, sir.
So it's right discovering that scale.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. So the greedy approach basically is say, okay, let's take broad and start doing dyadic division in a very greedy way, and we can in fact what pops out the filter bank that provides maximum information about articulatory gestures is the one that is very scarily similar to the empirically measured sort of ERB, like a MEL filter bank type thing. There's a parallel research that we did more from a filter bank design and Bayesian probability of error minimization, which also kind of when we apply it to speech data shows similar type of structure. And this was pretty exciting, although very preliminary and new. But this type of sort of using the relation between this production data and the kind of processing that happens is sort of very encouraging. And so this was published last year in JASA. And we did it across languages, the production data from Cantonese and English and Georgian, and Male and female also very similar patterns. In this graph, these are across all these people. I don't have them separated here, but in the paper we have the results separated by male and female. Very similar results, both male and female and across languages, at least 3 languages we studied. So this was encouraging to actually begin asking computational questions like that. So final part, I'll finish it in 5 minutes. So typically when we try to do speech recognition, right, so we collect a lot of acoustic examples from people, and we try to build models of that, hopefully statistically. And then when an unknown sort of speech data comes, we extract similar features and look at the sort of likelihood of it being generated by the models we have in hand. So one could kind of extend this idea to build these models to enhance or augment the acoustic feature vectors with articulatory feature. People have done that a lot. In fact, there's nice work, including the thesis work of Katrin Kirchhoff, and many others, who did very good acoustic articulatory modeling. And that, to me, it's an important step forward, but it's not a very practical one because, you're not going to have access to articulatory data except for visible articulation, like, movement of the lips, maybe a little bit of the tongue tip, to do real-time sort of, speech recognition. And as an aside, right, and people who've done audio-visual speech, usually it helps only in robust recognition cases when it's very noisy outside. You can get some BIZEAM information that helps. But that didn't make a big bang in our field, as we can acknowledge that, as much as we would like, except in specific special cases. So the question would be, how do we, if we were to exploit speech production information, how would one go about doing that? So one way is to think about this as, okay, say I learn from data the mapping between articulation and acoustics, from training data. Now, if I can estimate so-called inversion problem from the acoustic data, a presumable veritable sort of articulatory measurements, can I use those estimated measurements as a part of my recognition scheme? So at the recognition time, you only have acoustic data, but by deriving articulatory representation from that, is that of any use? The idea being that those representations are more robust and they are more generalizable and so on. Okay, so the idea is, first we need to have for that a scheme for mapping from acoustics to these kinds of articulatory representation. So to learn those mapping, basically having availability of data like I showed is very handy. So we can use all our fancy modeling methods we've been trying on and in acoustic speech modeling and so on can actually come useful here. So here we kind of took for early work, we took the to be comparable to other people who can try this out, the X-ray microbeam data, the EMA corpus, MoCA TIMIT corpus, so several corpus and our own RT-MRI corpus to build these models. Okay, so what we want to do is the important trick here is not just any inversion. Inversion usually works, on a subject-dependent basis, on a talker-dependent. What we want to do is, like, given a speech of any arbitrary talker, I should be able to estimate articulatory features. The way we kind of propose so far is to say, well, let me have an exemplary sort of a map created from, say, one person, right? So I have, say, a lot of data for me. So now let's say someone like Hinek or Aaron talks something, we have data from them, I want to recognize that. So I project their data, acoustic data, onto my articulatory map. It's as though me speaking what they spoke. Use that articulatory data to augment the acoustic data to perform recognition. So that's the framework. Okay, so to do the inversion, we can set this up as follows. So we have a training data, articulatory acoustic joint feature vector data, and we can use that map to estimate the articulatory feature of the test speaker given their acoustic data. Okay, that's a problem. So some quick notation. So you have these train and articulatory acoustic data sets, the target feature, articulatory feature vector I want to estimate, and and these are L possible values of art. So we can say, imagine we can quantize that these articulatory position trajectories can only take finite number of values just for a computation purpose, and the probability of reaching that value at any given time. Okay, so I'm going to estimate this articulatory sequence as corresponding to an acoustic sequence by using two conditions. One, proximity condition, like any match we do, likelihood type thing. And another is the smoothness condition. Because these are dynamic speech production data, we can actually impose that articulatory trajectories don't vary wildly, so you can use smoothness constraint to fit these trajectories. So quickly, basically, you can set this up as an optimization problem, a search optimization problem. A nice thing, we've showed that, in fact, we can derive a recursion for deriving these inversion problem. So the details are another JASA paper that came out in 2010, since I'm going low on time. So to evaluate that, we used 3 different speakers worth of their articulatory data. These 2 are from timid corpus. This is from a spontaneous switchboard-like articulatory corpus. People just having a dialogue about random things. To make it talker independent, basically this is more or less like building generic acoustic models and finding an acoustic proximity also, so that then that can provide a link to the articulatory proximity, so you can map data from any speaker to the training speaker. Of course, you can see the mismatch term, the error term there. The quality is going to depend on how close the acoustic characteristics of the target speaker and the training speaker are. So we actually looked at, in our data set, we had the British speaker dialect and the American English speaker. You can see performance degradation. We also tried with non-native speakers and so on. But that's an interesting direction to take. So broad phonetic classification from phone recognition experiment, no language phonotactic models or anything. So here's the result. So without any articulatory features, you can do with just MFCCs, no delta features, no phonotactic model, about 49–50%. That's about what everyone gets for under these conditions. But if we add articulatory features, you can see a big boost. These are estimated articulatory features, and this is the exciting part of the data. The other part is the blue one is the one that's from the same speaker, so you have the same model, and these are from speech, spoken by different talkers, but projected onto this model. Okay. Now, if you add delta features, you can do better. So this early step actually is very encouraging, that we can use estimated using inverted articulatory features to actually boost basic phone recognition accuracy. So this is interesting, both from improving ASR accuracy, but more importantly, right, what it showed is that systematically we can explain, if we project someone's speech onto this articulatory acoustic model, it's as though this person speaks that. And you can actually see the difference between what are the differences between different strategies people use for producing speech, what are the mismatches in the articulatory domain, and it has implications for L2 speech production and so on. So that was kind of exciting. So that was preliminary. To make this happen more, what we set out to do now is to collect actually a large comprehensive corpus. So we just finished collecting from about 10 talkers a huge MRI corpus of about 470. It's a subset of the timid sentences, same one used by the MoCA timid folks. We also have the EMA point tracking data for half the speakers or more. We have some physiological data also, respiration and so on, to ask different questions. Now this kind of opens up, alongside with all the image extracted features that we have extracted, opens up a lot of possibilities for people interested in a variety of things, including speech recognition experiments. Yeah. So yeah, we're going to release it publicly, yeah. So that's the website, and I'll give the slides too, so all the references are there in the sites. So that's, again, something that will hopefully open up and, try out different ideas with these data. So in conclusion, our current research directions are multifold. From the technology side, we're trying to acquire, faster, better data. From the analysis side, a lot of different work on modeling, extracting different features, multimodal registration. That's a question that there's questions that were asked about multiple planes, different parts of the production apparatus. The source. using combining different modalities, ultrasound, EMA, and so on. All these are very interesting questions and very interesting signal processing questions, actually. So this is one thing that we're working on, multimodal registration. And of course, all this data is useful only we can say some interesting things with them. And so I think that's where the proof is in the pudding. It's good to show fun videos and so on. It gets a lot of hits on YouTube, but for moving science forward, I think we have to ask interesting questions. For example, some of my students are working. They believe in a lower manifold kind of representation of the articulatory phenomena, and they think that is what is cognitively meaningful. So they're looking at these compressive sensing ideas, and there's some preliminary results that they presented at InterSpeech last year. It's ongoing. So in conclusion, I think data is very important in speech research, as always it's been. And I think vocal tract, this kind of speech production data, it's a part of that big puzzle. It's in addition to billions of words of data we get it from these various internet sources and hours of speech data. I think vocal tract and speech production data, I think it's a part of the big picture. And the interesting thing is how we put these pieces together. But it's not an easy problem, I acknowledge. And I think because it involves not just technological and computational, but also very interesting theoretical questions that underlie that. But I think there's lots of promise and potential for many things, including speech recognition and synthesis. So it's an ongoing interdisciplinary sort of an effort, and I think it's not one particular methodology or discipline is not enough to solve this. So my colleagues and collaborators, in fact, are tremendous. In fact, because of them, we are able to even ask these questions, linguists and radiologists and signal processing people. So I thank you very much for your attention. So it's my favorite. Thank you. Hinek.
So I have to say that this data are quite amazing. I just couldn't believe it. Thanks very much. And of course, that was totally wonderful. I have two questions. One is very specific.
Sure.
Which is did you collect any children data, or is there any problem with children as usual?
Yes, we are in fact in the midst of doing that children collection because, as you know, I'm studying kids' speech is like one of my favorite topics. We are actually doing interesting. The first putting kids in a scanner is a challenging thing, right? But it's possible because people do a lot of brain scans, and so we started doing a sleep apnea study, pediatric sleep apnea study. Actually, that's ongoing at Children's Hospital, so to get the kinks out. But now I'm back doing just making them talk in the scanner, which is just ongoing. But I think it's a wonderful area to explore. I think it's an important area.
Small children.
Small children, Initially, I'm focusing more on the 5 to 18 because still younger children, it's harder. But MR is easier than EMA or ultrasound type of thing.
But I also have one maybe larger question.
Sure.
I used to work or was interested in perception in the 80s. Since then, there is a lot of new data and a lot of research, and I have to admit I don't follow everything what is happening, which is unfortunate for me. But if I ask you, what do you think that is the biggest surprise since 80s, which happened now in studies of speech production or connection between speech production and speech communication in general? If I had to ask you for your opinion, what do you think, what was the biggest surprise which you perhaps encountered?
Surprise in relation between production and perception, you mean? Or
well, in general, sort of, when you are doing studies of speech production, so...
To me, the surprise is still how much we don't understand the very complex relationship, because we know, right, to me, as a EE guy, communication systems, we always design joint modeling of, receiver transmission. We design decoders. Here we have information here sitting there, guys. But when you look at this complex human system, which is dynamically adaptive and happening, we don't understand any other strategies as well as we should do. While we have these ideas about motor neuron, motor people have some. Then there are counterexamples for that. Every phenomena has examples supporting and examples disproving. But this whole network connection of these production perception systems is slowly emerging. And to me, the biggest surprise is why it's not known yet, and particularly why it's not quantitatively kind of modeled yet.
It's very hard to relate.
Yes. So for me, the interaction between sort of the motor control and production people and neuroscientists, I think that's another area where there's unbelievable things can happen. Yes.
It seems when you're adding in the articulatory features, those are the actual visual features traced from the images, right?
That's correct.
Okay. Have you thought about, is there work going on to translate your work in the visual field, or the images, into better speech production models? Because you can imagine as that model learns how to produce, those features are sort of like the motor features that you would think would be very predictive.
Interesting question. In fact, so I kind of, in the passing, alluded to one particular model or framework that we kind of subscribe to. For me, it was appealing because it's very control theoretic, sort of model, the task dynamic model of speech production on the Haskins laboratory. So we use that as an analysis by synthesis methodology to see how we can fit the model to it. But the thing is, it's a chicken-egg problem. The model is not perfect to begin with either. So the question is the representation we're deriving from the model, is maybe biased by some of. So we are trying some of this. In fact, I skipped those slides. I don't want to. Already, I showed you almost like an Indian buffet type, a lot of different things. But that's a good point. So the honest answer is it's not clear how well we can, exploit these kinds of interesting models and representations. So these kinds of, in articulative phonology, people believe that things are constriction-driven events. Those are the robust invariant representation, And if you derive them well from this data, then rest are all is basically just uncertainty term in your model. But that's not necessarily true how to derive them, because those are abstract, and mapping them to real data is not very clear. Or are there representations that these data allow us? We can ask those questions, like the kinds of questions of seeking manifolds, actually embedding, sort of seeking representations from data, and then putting them back in a model like that. These are both plausible ways of going at it. We are scratching, but I would say that we can generate interesting plots, but we haven't answered it. Yes?
I have a very short two technical questions and one broad one. The second question is, we saw several phonetic studies that you presented here, and how you deal with the bony structure, like here it would be the teeth and palate, how you deal with that, with the contact, etc., to drive your conclusions. Second, what's the difference between the electrical lithography and the 3D contact that you showed? I saw that's a bird that's, for me, I thought that was the same thing.
So for teeth, second part is easy, right? The lithography, basically, it was just a visualization to understand in 3D where contacts are being made. So since you have the retainer, you can actually model it 3D and then plot it in 3D. It's the same thing.
Oh, okay.
It's the same thing. It only provides contact patterns. Okay. The interesting information provides you contact patterns over time, so people can sort of infer things about timing.
Okay, so they are
that's easy.
Electrical lithography anyway. So.
On the question about the teeth stuff, so we had to be a little bit sort of try to be clever, but not entirely. I'll show you what we did. If I can get there. Oh, no, we have to unskip it or something like that.
Okay.
Okay, so what we did was the following. So some of these body structures, they don't change, right? But so what we can do is before the acquisition, like we do with every subject, we acquire 3D and we acquire all kinds of things. So we can acquire, if you make them people like push their tongue in the back and the lips in the front, we can get a clear outline of the teeth and the denture. And then with image processing, we can actually place it on all the, you can track the alveolar ridge region and put the teeth back in. It's kind of cheating. It's engineering, but we can do that. Early on in my early days, when I was a grad student, we can do more kind of vacuum things. So I made cast of people, and I actually measured it by cutting this and imaged that, and then imposed that on the images. We've tried things like coating things with oil and blueberry, asked them to hold blueberry juice. And basically, we tried to cover the teeth with things that have high proton content so we can get a contrast. None of that works, but this works.
Yeah.
And the broader question.
The broader question is, I think it was very clear. I don't understand much about the filter bank of the auditory,
Yeah.
But your theory seems to be interesting when you bring this to John Good and the neuroscience thing. How do you envision that we are doing speech production from this neuroscience aspect when we bring this auditory that when we have the perception, these motor areas are activated. So how envision that?
Yeah, so the way I've been, again, I kind of, think in terms that I kind of understand a little better was, usually the production phenomena mostly have been tried to view in a control theoretic way. It's, you have, things that you're controlling, goals you're reaching, accomplishing. Acoustic signal is just an output of this dynamical system, sort of, as an aside. Perception always focused on what of all these neural activities and so on. So but when you think about it, speech signal it's actually a communication signal. In a sense that while you use a control apparatus to produce it and sort of a demodulator processing system, you can think about this as joint design. So the way I always sort of, at least fancy imagining is as a control communication dual of the speech communication system. And to kind of make even a case for why theoretically these are interesting and useful, then you start looking at various pieces of this. Because these are not, there's feedback in these systems, because when we speak, I'm listening. When I'm listening, I'm actually, I believe people, neuroscientific evidence shows that I'm actually, my motor areas are going to trigger, particularly when I'm listening to someone that doesn't speak the same language as I do, or even speaks it sort of differently, like a non-native speaker. I'm a non-native speaker. There's lots of evidence that's emerging, right? There's evidence about people saying if there's a non-native speaker, your perception, if you are a non-native speaker, listening to a non-native speech is probably better than listening to native speech because of mismatch. People can actually start interpreting these as sort of error functions and model in terms of these communication system way. After all, there's lots of, here's where I believe that, often we ask, sort of, at least rhetorically, how can human processing and production help, machine processing? I believe that a lot of the mathematical formalisms we're using, even things like Bayesian theory and other signal processing, are actually explaining a lot of the phenomena that's happening in human areas, including these types of information maximization, uncertainty reduction type of things. So I think there's a good interplay between these things. And so a joint modeling of production perception using this information theoretic view or communication theoretic control theoretic view is a good way to go. But to move forward, there's lots of little pieces, building blocks that need to be in place. And I think they're emerging in the fields across different fields.
So I think we're
out of time. Yes.
I have a lunch question.
Yes.
Was there first the chicken or the egg? I mean, when it comes to this communication, there is a hearing and there is a speech, right?
Yeah.
So was it that the speech adapted to hearing, and was it that hearing adapted to speech, in your opinion? And do you have any evidence?
I don't have, this is because people say, evidence that toward hearing first, because we made noises, but we didn't make speech sounds. Natural sounds came first, even in acquisition, right? It happens to learn skill, but it happens in a way that it's, in a systematic way it's acquired. So it's not, speech is special, right? Because it's acquired in a way that's different from, us listening to a whole variety of sounds in the world around us. So hearing, I think, has been an important aspect, and many mammals have to, many animals do. So that's my belief, but we can debate this stuff.
I would agree with you.
Okay, so let's thank our speaker.